Hi everybody, in this video we're going to be discussing testing plans, and although my specialist field is IT and computing, I think it's first of all important just to bear in mind that a testing plan is not necessarily something that you'll find limited just to one industry. Testing plans are something which happen across many walks of life and many different types of industry. And if you think about the various different activities that we do, there are so many different types of testing plan out there that actually I think it's quite important just to bear that in mind. So although when I'm going through the slides that follow, it will be with the slant of IT, that doesn't necessarily mean that these theories can't be applied elsewhere. So first of all, the general goal of a testing plan is to detect errors. The goal of a testing plan is not to rush through it and try and prove that everything works when actually it doesn't work. Because if you think about the impact of that, it's pretty poor. So kind of from an IT background, if you have a piece of software and you are trying to prove to your boss by doing a testing plan that the project that they have given you works, and you just go through this testing plan very loosely, you say, oh yeah, everything works, and then you release that piece of software, then the impact could be disastrous. You think of obviously some very famous examples recently of computer games that have been poorly tested, and they've had many errors when it's come to release. So one of the most famous of these is Fallout 76, which was a disaster on release. There's another a few years further back, which would be Assassin's Creed Unity, where in my own example I was walking through the streets of Paris and all of a sudden I had other characters flying off into the sky or disappearing through the floor, and as an end user that looks very unprofessional. Now if you as a company then are trying to sell other games further down the line, I'm using games as the example in this instance, then people are going to be less likely to buy from you if pieces of software you've released have been faulty. And you can apply that to any type of software. You can apply that to any type of material, any type of machinery, a car, etc. If your product has faults in it, people won't buy from you, and that is why you do a testing plan, and you do a thorough testing plan to make sure that you can find all the errors, and then you can set goals in terms of actually fixing them. Now just bear in mind that the fixing of errors within a testing plan is generally not part of the testing plan itself. That is later in the cycle, because as with anything, this forms part of many different models, project modeling and so on, and the whole point about this is that you set out a testing plan. Generally you make your testing plan at the start of a project rather than towards the end, because it's based around what the goals of the project are, and then you will test it, you will provide evidence that you've tested it, and then you'll go and set some kind of action plan for areas which need improvement. And it can come in different ways, and ways that you won't expect, that I will cover in further slides. Now it is also true, I've had students say to me that Mike, when I develop my website, I'm constantly testing it throughout the development of my website, and that's very true. And I would expect students and developers alike and designers alike to be doing it constantly as they are making their product. I know I do it when I'm constantly making my product, but at the same time, the testing plan itself is a formal and systematic approach which happens towards the end of a project, but is generally set out towards the beginning of the project. And it's almost like, okay, well, I finished this part of what I need to do, and I'm now going to test it against the goals that I set out at the beginning of the project, and hopefully everything will work. But the idea is not just to go through it and basically lie if it doesn't work, because it needs fixing if it doesn't work. So what should be included? Well, it really does depend. And one of the big things that I have from students is, what do I include within a testing plan? Well, it really does depend on the original goals that have been set up by the project. You've got those. So you may have, if you're developing a website, you may have to create a certain amount of pages that all hyperlink together. You may have to have pictures within your website. You may have to have examples of CSS, which basically styles the page. You may have to have some multimedia, and if you're doing a database, you may have to have various examples of queries, and you may have to have forms. You may have to have validation that works. If you're doing programming, you may have to have loops. You may have to have nested if statements, and so on and so on. And it really does depend on the goals of the project. What does it need to do at the end? What does the person that is paying you, because ultimately that is the most important thing, who's paying you for this, what do they want from it? Okay. And also, what is going to be critical in terms of the testing plan what's going to be critical in terms of the project working? Okay. So what will stop the piece of software from working? So if I go to my website example, if you have a website with a range of different pages, you would expect all the hyperlinks to work, and actually the end user is really going to struggle to use your website if your hyperlinks, which is how you link web pages together, if they don't work. How are they going to get from your homepage to other pages within your website? If you have a database and your relationships don't work between the tables in your database, then the database won't work as you expect. If your validation doesn't work, then you might have data in there that means that what comes out of your system is worthless. It's something called garbage in, garbage out. If what goes into your system is wrong to begin with, then what comes out of your system is never ever going to be right. So it really does depend, and you can pretty much test anything, and you'll find that in industry, tests and testing plans will go into very, very kind of specific, detailed things, and it's for a very important reason. Ultimately, if things don't work within software that you release, then it's going to look bad. People may want refunds. People may not buy from you again, and it may be some really quite straightforward things. And if you think about a car, for example, if I've just paid £20,000 for a car and my indicator lights aren't working, then I will take the car back, and I will be reluctant to get another car from that dealer, or I say dealer, that manufacturer. And you can apply this to all sorts of different things, and that's where you need to be quite specific about things. So I've seen so many testing plans down the years that have some very, very vague tests and some very vague write-ups of the test. So, for example, do all the hyperlinks work? Well, how you think of how many hyperlinks are within a website? A standard commercial website probably has hundreds. That would just be way too broad. You would need to test all of the hyperlinks, and you would need to have individual tests for all of the hyperlinks, and you'd need to test them in every browser, and you would need to test them on a mobile device and on a games console probably. So all of a sudden you're looking at many hundreds of different tests there, and you need to say what the result is, and it'll be the same within a database. If you think of a standard database and you're running a query, then do all your queries work? It is just too vague. What happens when you run the query? Actually say, a specific query, okay? And all of a sudden you may have 4 or 5 different queries that you will test, and they may all work, and that will be great if that's the case. But actually, if you say that all your queries work, and then you find later on that one of your queries doesn't work, then what you've been testing is worthless. You need to test specific things within your database in that example. And then when you're recording it, you need to say exactly what happened. So you don't just say, oh, it worked. Well, what happened? So if you're testing a hyperlink, then your feedback could be it went from page 1 to page 2 with maybe, I don't know, whatever would have happened. Maybe it took a long time to load. I mean, this is why you describe what happened in case there are other things that may crop up. So if you have a web page and it doesn't display properly, then maybe you want to be describing, it works because, let's say if you're going hyperlink or testing a hyperlink that goes from page 1 to page 2, it may work, but what if it takes 30 seconds to load? Well, actually, that's something that needs to be noted. That's something that needs to be addressed. Why is it taking that long to load on maybe IE or Firefox or whatever it is? What happens if there comes up with a security error for whatever reason that might be? The actual test may work, but you may need to record more about it, which then may mean you need to address it further in the future. You may find that the same thing, just addressing the last point here, will have various different tests. So let's think of a form or a table in a database, and you have an input type of date. Okay. And you have a box that you want to take in date that says date of birth, and you've set the data type to be date, and straight away you have three things for you to test. You first of all put in the date, the one that you expect to be accepted into the form. You would then test something other than a date, so maybe you type some text in there. And finally, you would leave it blank. So what we call in the IT industry null. There's a null value. So the bottom two really should return an error. What happens if that doesn't happen? Also, you could test. You can enter the date, but the wrong type of date. So you may have year as opposed to the full 4-digit year. So there's lots of different things that you can test there straight away, and you can quickly see how these testing plans in industry in the real world becomes these massive, huge, great big things that take a long time to go through. Fortunately, I'm assuming you're watching this because you're in education, and testing plans don't tend to be anywhere near as in depth. But however, it's still very good practice to get into the habit of testing very specific things rather than just going, oh yeah, we're just going to test all these and we're going to say it's all wonderful, but when that actually doesn't happen. What should be recorded? Well, whatever happens, just say exactly what happens. There's no point in saying it works if it doesn't work. There's no point in either of those two as bits of feedback. Do not tell whoever is looking at that plan later on anything. It doesn't tell you anything. What happens if you look at the test a week down the line? Can you remember what happened? It's not useful. There may be parts of the program that worked, there may be parts of the program that didn't work. Maybe you're trying to load a bit of CSS into a web page and that works. However, generally the user interface needs improving. Maybe the text doesn't respond the same way that you think it will, and you need to describe that. So how do you need to lay it out? Well, actually there's no set method for doing this, and you'll find that different people do different things, and even among lecturers, teachers, you'll find that different tutors will look for different things, which I appreciate can be confusing. However, generally what you're going to have within there is an explanation of the test, and within that you may well describe your test data. So what are you testing? What is the expected result? So what do you expect to happen? Those are the two that you generally set out at the beginning of your project. Now you may include the date in there. I said it'll be maybe a goal to complete the test by. You may have a start date and an end date if you want the project, if you want the test to run over several days, or maybe even a time. You may want to have the priority in there. What is the most important test that you want in there, the one that will stop everything else from working. Now, obviously, the actual result is a description. You say what actually happened. Assume that the person who is looking at the testing plan is completely unknowledgeable about this subject, would be my advice to any person in education doing that. Don't just think, it's obvious what's going to happen. If it is so obvious, write it down, because at the end of the day, if the teachers don't need it, then they will just move on past it. But if it isn't there and the teacher does need it, then there's not a lot that can be done about it. Evidence, I'll go on to the next page, but generally in the form of screen grabs. So, excuse me. Generally, if I go back to this table, so students tend to take tables like this and put it into a Word document. They tend to keep the Word document in portrait mode for the most part, and then they tend to make their screen grabs really tiny, and there's very little point in that. First of all, if you've only got 4 columns in your table, you should make it horizontal. That would be a sensible thing to do. And then you can stretch your columns out to give you a bit more space. I am happy for my students to put, almost like referencing, to put a number in this column. Screen grab 1, for example, and then you can actually put in this column C screen grab 1, and then you have the screen grabs below the table, and then you can make them nice and big. However, I am aware that not every tutor is necessarily happy for that to happen, but I am, because at the end of the day I want the evidence somewhere in that document, and I would rather some nice big clear screen grabs rather than these tiny little fiddly things that if I can't see what is in the screen grab, I'm not going to guess what is in the screen grab, and you would get referred for it, or you would get failed for it, depending on what you're doing. Remember that the screen grabs are evidence of you doing the testing plan, because let's be honest here, if the screen grabs didn't exist, then there would be absolutely no evidence that you have actually performed the test. Okay, so that is why they are in existence. You may find that as you go further into a industry that they may not need all the evidence that is needed in academic circles. However, you need to do it if you're in education, and it's not a particularly difficult thing to do, but it is a slow process. Okay, now I've got some examples, because as I was suggesting, there's a lot of different types of testing plan out there. I thought I would put some at the end just to kind of give you an idea. So this is a usability test, and you can see how many different things are within this testing plan. I'm not going to go through each and every one of those, but this is a very different type of testing plan to the one that I suggested. I would not expect this from a computing student. I'll just put that out there straight away. I'm just giving this as an example. This also, although it is more of the actual topics that I would expect, it's actually not a million miles away, but it hasn't got the evidence form. Within education, you would need the evidence, and I would need more description of what the user was going to test. So what things are you going to put into the table? What things do you expect to happen? And then obviously what did happen, with some evidence there. And then finally, this is, I appreciate that if you're going to be viewing this on a small screen, you're probably not going to be able to read the writing here, but this is another example of a testing plan for somebody using a website. It's okay. It's a bit brief. It doesn't really kind of explain what they're going to do. I would ideally look for a bit more depth in here. So you've got some swings and roundabouts here, because ultimately this table here that I'm showing has way more columns in it, than what I would expect from a student. However, it doesn't really have the depth of analysis and explanation as to what actually happened. And this is where I'm saying that ultimately some tutors may ask for slightly different things when you come to be doing this, but ultimately the purpose of a testing plan remains the same, and the testing of specific things should always be looked at and should always be undertaken. Well, thank you for listening. I appreciate testing plans are not the most thrilling of topics, but they are absolutely crucial in any computing topic that you encounter. I mean, pretty much every part of computing will require testing, and it's just kind of getting out of bad habits and remembering not to be. I mean, this is not a difficult thing to do, but it's just kind of getting out of lazy habits and making sure that you are being very clear as to what you're testing, and making sure that kick out the vagueness, okay? Because that is generally something that I would expect from level 1 and maybe at a push level 2 learners. I would certainly not expect it from level 3 learners. But like I said again, thank you very much for watching. I hope it has proved useful. Thank you very much.